Chairman will call the committee to order. For my colleagues and for those assembled, the plan is to conduct opening statements. We have competing hearings, one upstairs that's pretty well attended. So we'll get through the opening statements, and then we'll wait until that hearing ends. I will call up the bill, and then we'll hold off for amendments and stuff until afterwards. So I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today, our subcommittee will mark up legislation that will provide certainty to producers and recyclers of coal combustion byproducts, while also ensuring the safe and appropriate disposal and monitoring of coal combustion byproducts, or CCRs. Since the very first hearing in this subcommittee, regulation of CCRs have been a topic of discussion, coal combustion residues. We learned early on that regulating coal combustion residues as a hazardous waste when these materials do not even meet EPA's own standard for toxicity would have devastating effects on jobs and a very successful and emerging byproducts industry. At the same time, this proposed overregulation by the Environmental Protection Agency will raise utility prices for families across the country. We heard firsthand from a utility manager in my district the immediate impact would be a 25% increase in the cost to consumers. With the economy sputtering, we can't afford to have jobs put at risk because of the political appointees think it's a good idea. In our legislative hearing on H.R. 1391, independent experts testified further on the inability of coal combustion residue to reach the threshold necessary for regulation as a hazardous material, even though EPA is claiming it is. Further, the witnesses called into serious question whether the Obama Environmental Protection Agency actually gave appropriate consideration to important practical factors that, if done, would have radically altered its final decision. I am not suggesting government should take a holiday on these matters. When it comes to oversight and protection from risks, there is no doubt it is the government's responsibility to check on these activities. The question becomes, who is the appropriate monitor? State officials affirm their expertise and desire to regulate this area without federal control. Given the unique challenges of each individual state, I believe this is the best approach. The legislation therefore creates a new subsection to Subtitle D of the Solid Waste Disposal Act. That establishes targeted authority to address the management and disposal of coal combustion residues at landfills, surface impoundments, and other land-based units. This program, which will be led by the state, or EPA if the state cannot or does not want to operate it, will for the first time ever create national enforceable requirements for groundwater monitoring, liners at landfills, corrective action when environmental damage occurs, and structural stability criteria to prevent issues like the one that caused the problems at Tennessee Valley Authority in Tennessee. In working with stakeholders, we have received broad support for this legislation, including state environmental officials, the Beneficial Use Committee, and other regulated stakeholders. And I want to place into the record 2 letters, one from the Edison Electric Institute and US SWAG from the industry, and also ECOS, which is the Environmental Council of the states, both supporting this legislation. They all believe the provisions in this bill will protect jobs, encourage economic growth and job creation, and prevent unnecessary higher energy prices and construction costs. I want to thank Representative McKinley for his leadership, as well as Representative Latta for his efforts on the subcommittee to move this jobs legislation forward. As we move this bill to full committee consideration, I hope we can work with all members to present a bipartisan bill to the full House. And with that, I've finished my time and I yield back. I'd like to now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Green from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I find it unfortunate we're wasting our opportunity to demonstrate a rare moment of bipartisanship today. Our subcommittee held legislative hearing on April 15th on the original legislation by Representative McKinley. In that hearing, I believe the general consensus was a path forward on the issue of regulating coal ash was to be done under Subtitle 2 of RCRA, and to work together to come to an agreement. Despite member-level discussions between myself and you, along with Chairman Emeritus Dingell, we've been unable to have substantial staff-level discussions on a bipartisan agreement on the bill before the subcommittee today. I find it disheartening that the majority has said they wish to work with us, but they still sent around a new bill before they answered questions posed by our staff for potential negotiations. This bill leaves a lot to be desired and clearly has a lot of kinks that need to be worked out. After reading it, though, I'm more confused as to how this program will work and even more confused by the role of the EPA and their responsibilities as well as authority under the new legislation. I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered and clarifications need to be made in order for the legislation to be successful. Right now, as I see it, the bill is like fitting a square peg into a round hole and ultimately setting this program up for failure. The last thing we want to do is direct the EPA and the states to do something that isn't going to work. Now that this could be what our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are hoping for, but I don't see how this helps either our industry or the environment. Mr. Chairman, my staff's reached out to your staff to sit down and work on the legislation and hopefully come to some sort of agreement. I'm hoping these conversations will be more productive than last week. We're here to work on a common sense solution and not waste precious committee time punting bills to the Senate that have zero chance of passing. And I thank you, and I'll yield to any of my Democratic colleagues that would like the remainder of my time. Okay, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Barton, for 3 minutes.
For how long? 3?
I'm told 3.
3, okay. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you and the ranking member on the minority for both sides playing by the rules last week. I think we ought to commend the minority staff and their leadership for finding the technical error and pointing it out. And I want to commend you and Chairman Upton for honoring the rule and withdrawing it so we could fix it. It shows the institutional integrity of the committee and the leadership on both sides. And while it has delayed the issue being addressed, it shows that the Energy and Commerce Committee plays by the rules. So I'm very supportive of what happened last week. On the issue before us, the Recycling Coal Combustion Residuals Accessibility Act of 2011 and the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act bill. This is something that needs to be addressed. I do not believe that coal ash is a hazardous material in the most technical sense of the word. Subtitle C of RCRA created a hazardous waste management program that, among other things, directs the EPA to develop criteria for identifying and managing all waste deemed to be hazardous to human health and the environment. Subtitle D of RCRA established state and local governments as the primary planning, regulating, and implementing entities. So under RCRA, it's the state that's preeminent, not the EPA. EPA, though, has decided that it should be preeminent, and they are now
may not regulate coal combustion residuals under Subtitle C of RCRA. This is in line with what the utility and advocates of beneficial reuse have favored all along, which is regulation under Subtitle D of RCRA, the non-hazardous section. Now, I want to explain how this is different from the original H.R. 1391, the McKinley bill. Many of my colleagues here today are sponsors of that bill, and the original language would bar any entity, state, federal agency, et cetera, from regulating coal combustion residuals under Subtitle C of RCRA. State associations that regulate municipal solid waste were concerned about this provision because when some coal ash is burned, it can contain higher than permissible levels of contaminants which warrant a hazardous designation. My amendment in the nature of a substitute recognizes this concern, and a similar provision, as I said, is included in the base bill which we are working off of today. I'd refer you to page 3, section 3, maintenance of subsections 4005C, et cetera. Therefore, if any of my colleagues were supportive of the original McKinley bill with some of the modifications in the base bill today, that would be voting in favor of my amendment today would be very consistent. Mr. Chairman, as I stated in my opening statement, I would like to continue to work with you and my colleagues on this bill. But I think that a vote on this amendment is needed to show the support from both sides on a proposal to regulate coal combustion residue under Subtitle D of RCRA, and I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Would the gentleman yield for a second before I speak?
I would be happy to yield to the gentleman.
You understand that by striking all after the enacting clause and replacing with the original McKinley bill, that the provisions that you have fought for in the amendment which we included would not be in the base bill?
That is correct, but they're not as necessary because it's a different regulatory scheme. If, in other words, the states right now have seen fit to allow this practice, and we don't see anything in this that would make that discontinue, but if we're...
And the, obviously, I'll yield back to you, and would you yield back your time then? Are you done?
Yield back the balance of my time.
I would then recognize myself now for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. This amendment is the text of the original McKinley bill and prohibits the Environmental Protection Agency from regulating coal combustion residuals under Subtitle C. The effect of this amendment is the same as the floor amendment that my colleague from Wisconsin voted against in H.R. 1. The whole reason we're here with this bill is because simply prohibiting action under C is not enough, and it could open beneficial uses for an uncertain regulatory climate. In addition, the amendment only includes certain kinds of waste and not as many as non-hazardous coal combustion waste as are contemplated in the underlying bill. This means that the EPA could come back later and place these unenumerated items under Subtitle C, putting beneficial users in the same bad spot they are in right now. A new C designation removes certain types of waste streams that beneficial users could access to promote more jobs in her state, in my state, and across the country. Moreover, this amendment would hamstring the states because some of them are constrained to take only those actions that are permissible by the EPA. It is also not clear what my colleague would like to see as a disposal replacement, including how we would address surface impoundments, landfills, groundwater testing, and structural integrity issues. While these are clear in the underlying bill, the amendment shoots first and worries about the consequences later. This is the kind of uncertainty that will increase in consumer costs and won't power people's air conditioning in the summer heat or heat in the winter. Finally, the economic analysis Subtitle D proposals that EP has proposed could cost $22 to $34 billion to the economy and between 39,000 to 64,000 jobs. That's a huge risk to take with 9% unemployment. So I urge my colleagues to oppose.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
I just want to note that the EPA is going through a very comprehensive process right now, dealing with a lot of the, if not all of the issues you just listed, and this amendment would allow that process to continue. So I think your concerns would be addressed with the agency, but
Well,
I yield back to the
reclaiming
gentleman.
my time, you have much greater faith in the EPA than I do. So anyone else seeking time? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by my colleague from Wisconsin. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The roll call vote is requested. Roll call is called. If you want to, I'm happy to do that. So I don't know how to. If the yes, the gentleman from.
May I make unanimous consent that the vote on the pending amendment be postponed until all time has expired on this legislation and, of course, prior to final passage?
If the gentleman would yield.
Certainly.
For my colleagues, in essence, we're trying to go through the amendments, roll the votes to the end, cast votes on the amendments, and then on the underlying bill. I have no objection. Gentleman from,
I just want to say, as one that helped write the rule, that it's up to the chairman, and if we roll votes, the rule is such that you, Mr. Shimkus, and Mr. Green, if you have an agreement to roll the votes, that's how it's done.
That's fine.
But you need to get an agreement between you two, and if you decide to do that, then that's just fine. And the vote will be held until at the end.
The Chair, if the gentleman would yield back his time, or if I could, then it's, the ranking member, Mr. Green, and I have been in consultation, and we'll go through the amendments. Once the amendments are been offered, we'll then vote on the amendments and roll final passage at the end of the amendments. So having no objection, so ordered. The chair now seeks time for an amendment offering. Who has an amendment? Anyone seeking recognition?
Okay.
If not, why did we go through that process?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for 5 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes. Striking last order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to think the legislation put forth by the majority that needs some more work, and I'd like to ask council some questions to see if we can highlight some of the issues that weren't addressed in this bill. First of all, council, does the draft bill envision that the EPA would develop revised criteria specific to coal combustion residuals, or would the revised criteria only be which the EPA has already promulgated under 40 CFR Part 258 for the municipal solid waste?
The bill as currently drafted would not prevent EPA from updating Part 258 should it see fit.
Okay. Number two is EPA's role under the draft bill. What is EPA's role under the draft bill? For example, states are to certify that the state would adopt and implement a coal combustion residuals program to the administrator of EPA.
Gentleman, I'll ask my colleagues near the door to take their conversations into the cloakroom so that my colleague can be heard.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sure they're listening to these questions intently. Does the draft bill envision that the EPA would revise or approve that certification from the states? And if not, how does the draft bill envision the EPA would find the state rules or certification deficient?
The certification is the states basically just saying to EPA that, or they notify the EPA that they're going to do the program, and then they certify that they have the appropriate rules and statutes in place. EPA can, if it's brought to EPA's attention that the states aren't properly implementing the program, EPA sends a notice to the states. The states have a 6-month time period to remedy the deficiencies with, and if at that point EPA does not feel that the deficiencies have been remedied, they would be able to take over the program.
EPA could do that on their own volition. They don't have to have someone to request that.
The bill says if it's brought to the attention of EPA,
Okay, so they could do that in-house.
presumably.
Okay. Number three, the draft bill envisions only one permit will be enforced at any one time. Under the draft bill, EPA can implement a permit program if the state does not meet certain provisions under the draft bill. However, the bill also indicates that a state can adopt a program after EPA begins to implement a permit program. What's the transition process between an EPA's permit and a state permit?
The typical process is that the existing permits would remain in force until the program has been transitioned from the EPA to the state.
So the initial state permit would still be in effect until EPA's process is complete.
That's correct.
Okay. Number four, the draft bill appears to provide EPA the authority to implement a permit program for coal combustion residuals. If the state does not have a program as described in the draft bill, does this include enforcement provisions? So what authority would EPA have to enforce the program if a state, a good example, if the state does not have a program?
The bill as currently drafted doesn't provide EPA with enforcement authority.
So if half our 50 states don't do anything, the EPA doesn't have any authority over this particular coal combustion residuals.
That's correct.
Good. Would gentlemen yield and follow up on that?
Glad to.
I guess the question is, would the EPA still have general enforcement authority?
They would have authority, imminent hazard authority under 7003.
Thank you. I thank my colleague.
Okay. Number 5, the draft bill states that the state should maintain an approved program under Section 4005C or authorized program under Section 30006 of RCRA. What is the relationship between this requirement and the remainder of the draft bill? And that is, why is this provision included and what issue does it address?
I'm sorry, what was the second half of your question?
Okay. The draft bill states that states should maintain an approved program under Section 4005C or an authorized program under Section 3006 of RCRA. What is the relationship between that requirement and the remainder of this draft bill? See, there's some confusion in the draft bill that I worry that EPA, we may not be giving EPA the guidance that most of us would like. And I wonder how that would work out in real life when EPA starts to look at it.
The requirement that states have a, either an approved MSW plan or an authorized 3006 is a checkoff for this. If the states have such programs currently in place, they are pre-approved, so to speak, to implement and adopt a coal combustion residuals permitting program in the state. And and so long as they maintain those programs, they continue to be able to do those CCR permitting program.
Okay. My last question, Mr. Chairman, is the draft bill provides no guidance on how EPA is to administer, if at all, this authority on Indian lands. Section 4011A only applies to states, which RCRA currently defines to exclude Indian tribes and Indian territories. Is the intent of the bill to give EPA the authority over the Native American lands or the Indian lands?
The bill as currently drafted doesn't address tribal lands.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, these questions highlight some of the issues that I think hopefully we can work together between now and the markup and the full committee. And I hope we have a real opportunity to put a bill together that'll have a chance of passing in the Senate, because I think we need to solve the problem of coal ash, and instead of just sending something to the Senate, and hopefully the majority will work with our side before we get to the full committee this week. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time.
Mr. Chairman,
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment. Is there a number?
Number 2.
An amendment offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act has a simple purpose: to protect public health and the environment from unsafe disposal of solid waste. My amendment would bring that purpose into this legislation. This amendment is necessary because without it, the authority of states and EPA could be limited in ways that put human health and the environment at risk. Under the existing language, a state could put in place an insufficient program, one that threatens human health, and so long as they file the required certification, they're done. There would be no way for the EPA to intervene to provide the necessary safeguards. If we adopt this amendment, state plans will have to meet the existing standard for disposal under Subtitle D of RCRA, meaning that they will have to include criteria necessary to protect public health and the environment. EPA will have the authority to step in if states fail to protect public health and the environment, and if EPA steps in, it will have to implement a program that protects public health and the environment. It's that simple. It could mean the difference between a protective regime and one that puts people at risk. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
And the gentleman yields back his time. Does anyone seek recognition in opposition to the amendment? If not, I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition. In the beginning of the markup, I highlighted the fact that the Environmental Council of the States, which is the environmental agencies from the states, submitted a letter in support of this legislation, just underlining the fact that they feel that this helps them protect the health and the community. This amendment requires coal combustion residuals permit programs to protect human health and the environment, also inserts criteria for the location of landfills. This well-meaning amendment contains language that we feel is unnecessary. Page 3, lines 16 through 19, requires that that state coal combustion residues program cannot be less stringent than the requirements of the revised criteria. These revised criteria, which are defined on page 13, lines 9 through 13, already are implicit in section 410C, which states the criteria shall be those necessary to protect human health and the environment and may take into account the practical capability of such facilities. The amendment does not add any new requirements for protection on human health and the environment, but could remove some flexibility on the technical feasibility of its application. In addition, the Municipal Solid Waste Program and the Part 258 criteria, the baseline for the coal combustion residues program in the states is based on the requirement that programs be protective of human health and the environment. Many states are already regulating coal combustion residue in manners that is protective of human health and the environment. Part 258 also contains criteria regarding the location of coal combustion residue management and disposal structures. This amendment seeks to add items that do not need to be added since they are already picked up by the underlying bill and its regulations.
Would the gentleman yield for
I
a
would
question?
be happy to yield.
Is it your understanding then that if a state adopts a position that could be challenged as being unsafe, not protective of the public health and the environment, that EPA could step in and correct it or not approve it on that basis?
Yeah, if the gentleman would yield, they would have to meet the criteria under the bill, which is established in the language. So,
So if they did not meet the criteria and were not protective of public health and the environment, EPA could deny a state's plan.
well, it would have to be, obviously, the state's going to, in essence, certify that they're going to be under the regime, and then someone would have to identify that they're not meeting the standard. Then EPA would then have the authority.
Thank you.
And without anyone else seeking recognition, I yield back my time. Anyone else seeking recognition in support or opposition of the amendment? Hearing none, the vote then occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the noes have it. Gentleman requests a roll call vote, and the roll call vote will be called at the end of the amendment offerings. Then, are there anyone else seeking recognition to offer an amendment? If there are no further amendments, the clerk will call the roll on the Baldwin amendment.
Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, nay. Mrs. Bono Mack. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Wada. Mr. Wada, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Shimkus.
Mr. Shimkus votes no.
Mr. Shimkus, nay.
Any other members seeking opportunity to vote? The clerk will report. I know you're still tallying. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 7 ayes, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. If there, the clerk will now call roll on the Waxman amendment.
Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, nay. Mrs. Bono Mack. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Shimkus.
Mr. Shimkus votes no,
Mr. Shimkus, nay.
and the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 7 ayes, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. If there are no further amendments, the question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. I'd like to thank my colleagues for their attention and their work, and I look forward to working with some of my colleagues on the other side for, in the interim, to see if there's something we can do to be to address some of their concerns. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Again, the chair thanks the members and staff. The committee stands adjourned.